The last thing Sergeant Robin Alden did before the Vael fleet crossed the heliopause was fix the coffee machine in the garrison break room. She used a bent paperclip, half a roll of electrical tape she'd found at the bottom of her kit bag, and 17 minutes of profanity directed at no one in particular. The machine had been broken for 3 weeks. 3 technicians with actual tools had pronounced it a write-off. Robin got it running on spite alone. She poured herself a cup, took one sip, and set it on the counter, still steaming when the proximity alarms went off. That was 14 months ago. Now she sat in a cage made of something that wasn't metal, something that hummed faintly against her palms as if alive, and tried to remember what coffee tasted like. The Vael didn't cage their prisoners in the way humans caged animals. There were no bars, no locks anyone could pick, no walls to measure with pacing steps. The enclosure was a field of resonant energy that the Vael emitted naturally from glands along their thorax, a byproduct of their biology, modified into weaponry, which was, Robin had come to understand, basically the whole story of the Vael as a species. They were creatures who had learned to turn everything natural about themselves into a weapon, and then forgotten that anything else had ever been possible. She didn't know that on day one. She learned it slowly, the way you learn anything in captivity, by having nothing to do but watch. They were tall, the Vael. Not grotesquely so, but enough that every human in the prisoner compound had to look up to meet their eyes. 3 of them, arranged in a triangle on a face that was otherwise smooth and pale as old bone. They moved in silence. Not the silence of discipline or stealth, but the silence of creatures who had evolved in a world where sound carried predators. Even their language, when they deigned to use it among themselves, was felt more than heard. A subsonic pulse that Robin felt in her back teeth and behind her sternum, like standing next to a speaker turned up just past the threshold of pain. They smelled like ozone and overripe fruit. She learned that too, slowly, the way you learn anything. There were 11 humans in the compound when Robin arrived. By the time the thing happened, the thing she still couldn't quite explain to her own satisfaction, there were 9. Castellan, the fire control specialist from the Perseverance, had died of a respiratory infection that the Vael had observed with clinical detachment and done nothing to treat. Yusuf Okafor, the xenobiology postdoc who'd been aboard the research vessel Meridian when it was interdicted, had simply vanished one morning. No one asked where he'd gone. Nobody asked the Vael anything. You learn that quickly, too. The 9 survivors were Robin, a Martian colonial engineer named Dessa Varga who'd been captured when her survey team stumbled into a Vael patrol corridor, an elderly astrophysicist named Dr. Chantal Foos, who had the unsettling habit of humming to herself while she did complex mathematics in the dust, 3 soldiers from the 14th Rapid Response, Privates Mako Ndiaye, and a young man everyone called Pockets because he'd been found with 11 separate hidden pockets sewn into his jumpsuit, all of them empty. A teenage girl named Sola, who claimed she'd been a stowaway on a commercial freighter, and whom no one quite believed. A burned-out diplomatic aide named Renard Kowalczyk, who had stopped speaking in coherent sentences sometime around month 3, and Robin herself. 9 humans, in a cage that hummed. The Vael were not cruel in the way humans understood cruelty. They did not taunt or threaten or punish for the satisfaction of it. They were, and this was the word Robin kept coming back to, the word that sat in her chest like a swallowed stone, incurious. They looked at the humans with those 3 triangulated eyes and registered them the way you registered weather. Present. Predictable. Not requiring engagement. The cage was maintained by a single Vael technician who came twice daily to calibrate the field emitters. Robin called him the Warden, though she knew he wasn't. He was young. She could tell by the incomplete tessellation of the bony ridges along his cranium, which, according to what she'd pieced together from Dr. Foos's hushed theorizing, filled in progressively with age. He performed his calibration with the automatic competence of someone doing a thing they'd done 10,000 times and expected to do 10,000 more. He never looked at them directly. He never varied his routine by a single step. Robin watched him every time. She lay on her back on the floor of the enclosure. The floor was warm, always exactly body temperature, which was somehow worse than cold would have been, and turned what she'd observed over in her head, the way you turn a stone, looking for the edge that catches light. The field has a dead zone, she told Dessa on day 41 in the compound, or what she was fairly sure was day 41. There was no reliable way to track time. She'd been counting sleep cycles, which she knew wasn't reliable, but it was something. Dessa looked up from the wall she'd been studying. Dessa studied everything. She had the engineer's instinct of seeing every structure as a problem statement. Where? Bottom left corner, near the secondary emitter housing. When the warden runs his calibration sequence, there's about 3 seconds where the frequency notches down. I can feel it in my hands, the vibration drops. 3 seconds isn't enough to, by itself, no. Robin sat up, but the field runs on a cycle. The notch is at the same point in the cycle every time. And the cycle is, she paused. Dessa, what's your feel for how long a cycle runs? Dessa frowned at the air. Engineers always looked slightly ridiculous when they were calculating. Like they were trying to read something written on the inside of their own skull. Roughly 26 seconds? Give or take. 24.3, Dr. Foos said without looking up from whatever she was writing in the dust. I've been counting. Robin and Dessa looked at each other. Have you? Robin said. The old woman made a small satisfied sound like someone finishing a particularly pleasant meal. I've also been counting the secondary emitter's voltage draw, which you can estimate from the pitch of the harmonic it throws off on its downstroke. The notch you're describing corresponds to a roughly 37% reduction in field density in a cone approximately 60 centimeters wide at the base. Silence. You've been here 6 weeks, Dessa said. 7, the old woman corrected. I was here a week before you arrived, dear, and you haven't mentioned any of this. Dr. Foos finally looked up. Her eyes were very dark and very calm. I didn't have enough data, I do now. I was waiting for someone to come to me with the question. Because in my experience, the people who go looking for answers are more useful than the ones who wait to be told. You've just confirmed my estimate, Sergeant. She nodded at Robin. Your paperclip is showing. Robin blinked. Then she looked down at her collar, where she'd been keeping a small collection of scavenged items, pressed flat against the fabric by habit. A piece of wire she'd worried free from the field emitter housings, a fragment of the food packaging the Vael dropped in twice daily, a flattened strip of something metallic she'd found on the floor and hadn't identified yet. She looked back up. What do you need me to do? Nothing tonight, the old woman said. Tonight I need to verify the resonance frequency of the emitter housing at full cycle. I'll do that by singing. Singing, specific pitches allow me to identify sympathetic resonances in the structure. It's rather like being a bat, except slower and better at calculus. She tilted her head. Also, it's nice. I like singing. I haven't had much occasion for it lately. She began to hum very quietly in a key Robin couldn't name. It was an old melody, the kind that felt like it had been sung for a long time before words were found for it. Robin had heard something like it before, somewhere she couldn't quite place. A kitchen, maybe. Someone moving around a small space and would fit with sound. Across the enclosure, Pockets was listening. So was Sola. Young faces doing the thing young faces do when they hear music. Going soft around the edges, like something hard is briefly released. Mako pulled his knees up to his chest and closed his eyes. Ndiaye, who hadn't spoken a word in 11 days, said very quietly, "My mother used to do that." Nobody answered. It wasn't a statement that required an answer. The humming continued. The warden came the next morning, same as always. Same footfall, same route, same exact sequence of movements at the calibration panel. Robin stood against the far wall, watching him with the loose, casual attention of someone with nowhere to be. And she thought, you don't even see us. You've looked at us every day for, she counted, 42 mornings and you still don't see us. We are weather to you. A constant, you stopped accounting for the moment it became constant. This, she had decided, was the Vael's primary failure. Not their technology, which was considerable. Not their numbers, which were terrifying. Not their capacity for coordinated action, which had allowed them to sweep through 12 human colonies in 14 months without meaningful resistance. It was this. They had made the elementary mistake of believing that a thing that had not changed yet would never change. They had looked at humanity, a species that had, in the span of a cosmological eye blink, gone from stone tools to nuclear reactors to generation ships, and concluded that the version of humanity they first encountered was its final form. Robin was a sergeant in the Colonial Defense Force. She had spent 11 years learning how to teach people to survive things that should have killed them. She knew, in her body and her bones, that the version of humanity the Vael had captured was not humanity's final form. It wasn't even close. She gave Foos 3 more days to complete her calculations. She used those days to watch, to map the guards' patterns, to collect. She found another strip of metal. She separated a layer from the food packaging that had a different tensile property than the rest. She explained nothing to anyone except Dessa, who listened with her eyes narrowed and her hands very still. The way engineers listen when they hear something they think might actually work. On day 46, she was reasonably confident it was 46. Foos pressed something into her palm during the warden's morning calibration. It was a piece of wire bent into a specific shape that Foos had worked out through 7 separate testings over 3 days. Each one timed to the exact moment the warden's back was turned. It was small enough to hide under a fingernail. "The notch lasts 3.1 seconds, Foos murmured, in a voice pitched below the threshold the Vael seemed to react to. They'd established this empirically. The housing resonates at 214 hertz. This, she meant the wire, if inserted in the secondary coupling at the base of the emitter during the notch, will retune the resonant frequency by approximately 11 hertz. Not enough to be immediately obvious. Enough to make the notch last 6 seconds instead of 3. What does 6 seconds buy us? On its own, nothing. Compounded over 4 days each time I extended a little further, she smiled. It was a very small smile. She had the face of a woman who had spent 60 years being underestimated by people who should have known better. Well, let's call it an interesting variable. Robin looked at the wire in her palm. She thought about the coffee machine, the paperclip, the 17 minutes of profanity, the one sip she'd had before the world ended. 4 days, she said. Possibly 3, if you're quick. Tell me exactly where. Dessa, on day 48, created a distraction. She did this by simply sitting in the exact center of the enclosure and screaming. Not in fear, not in pain. In a long, flat tone that approximated as closely as she could manage the resonant frequency Dr. Foos had identified for her. It was the kind of scream that made people look. Vael guards appeared at the perimeter within 40 seconds. They were fast, the Vael, faster than they looked. All that stored reaction time from evolving in silence. 3 of them. 2 turned to observe, and 1 moved to the calibration panel, which was standard response protocol. Robin had watched it happen once before, when Pockets had thrown a food container and triggered a brief flurry of activity. During the 37 seconds the guard was at the calibration panel, Robin was at the emitter housing. She did not think about the field. She did not think about what would happen if the notch didn't occur, or if it occurred early, or if she was wrong about any of the 100 things she'd staked this on. She had been wrong before. She had pulled back the pieces of wrong decisions, and looked at them and learned from them, and done the next thing. That was what you did. That was the specific stubbornness that living in a body that could die had bred into her species over a very long time. 3 seconds. Wire in, fingers out. Nothing happened. The field kept humming. She walked back to the wall and leaned on it and breathed. That night Foos hummed again, and in the pattern of the humming Robin heard the confirmation. The frequency had shifted. 11 hertz. The notch would be longer tomorrow. It took 3 more days. 3 more insertions, each one extending the window fractionally. Each one requiring a distraction that the 9 of them organized with the wordless efficiency of people who have nothing to do but coordinate. Pockets faked a seizure on day 49 and sold it so completely that even Renard, who hadn't responded to anything in weeks, sat up and stared. Sola, on day 50, did something astonishing. She stood at the field boundary and began explaining, in a calm, clear voice, her theory that the Vael's 3-eyed visual system produced a blind spot at certain angles. And she demonstrated this theory by moving carefully into the blind spot while explaining it, so that by the time anyone noticed what she was doing, she was already back. The guards did not understand the words, but there was something in the quality of her voice, some specific human register of casual intellectual audacity that held their attention completely for 40 seconds. Later Robin asked her where she'd learned to do that. Sola shrugged. I was a stowaway, she said. For real, for 3 years. You learn how to make people look at you instead of what you're doing. That's terrifying, Robin said. Yeah. She didn't sound displeased about it. On the morning of day 52, Dr. Foos told Robin the window was 8 seconds. That's not enough, Robin said. No, but it will be enough to place this. From somewhere in her clothing, Robin had stopped being surprised by what the old woman produced from her clothing. She drew a fragment of the metallic strip Robin had collected, bent at a precise angle. At the junction between the primary and secondary coupling. It won't be noticed during calibration, but the next time the system runs a full diagnostic cycle, which happens automatically every 130 cycles, it will cause a cascade reboot of the emitter array. Robin stared at her. The array will take 47 seconds to complete the reboot sequence, Foos said. During that 47 seconds, there will be no field. How far to the outer perimeter? Based on what I've been able to observe from this position over 7 weeks, roughly 110 meters, through 2 guard stations, that's yes. Her voice was not unkind. I know what it is, Sergeant. I am not unaware of the mathematics. But I am also not unaware that 47 seconds of nothing is better than indefinite certainty of captivity. These are the options before us. I recommend we choose the one where something might happen, rather than the one where nothing will. Robin was quiet for a moment. She thought about Castellan, who had died of an infection, about Yusuf Okafor, who had simply not been there one morning, about the way the warden's eyes slid past them every day, registering nothing, about the 11 years she had spent teaching people to survive things that should have killed them. "Tell me where to place it," she said. She placed it on day 53 and then they waited. The waiting was the hardest part. The Vael's diagnostic cycle ran every 130 cycles of the emitter array, and each emitter cycle was approximately 24 seconds, which meant, and Foos confirmed this with the quiet satisfaction of a professor who has just watched a student arrive at the correct answer. The diagnostic ran approximately every 52 minutes. It was now approximately 41 minutes into the current cycle. 11 minutes. Robin stood against the wall and looked at each of the 9 faces. Dessa with her jaw set and her hands loose at her sides, Foos humming softly, eyes closed. Mako and Ndiaye in pockets in a line, all 3 of them doing the particular stillness of soldiers who have been told to wait and are waiting with the whole body. Sola sitting cross-legged, watching Robin watch the others with the eyes of someone running calculations of her own. Renard standing slightly apart, and for the first time in weeks, Robin thought she saw something conscious behind his eyes. Something that had come back to the surface. She didn't make a speech. She'd thought about it and decided against it. What she said was, "When it goes down, we run. If you go down, the person behind you keeps running. Not because we don't care. We care. But if we stop, the 9 people who ran for nothing becomes 8 and then 7 and then 0. We run until we're out or we're not." Nobody argued. Nobody needed to. "Foos," Robin said. 30 seconds approximately from about now, the old woman said, without opening her eyes. 23 seconds, as it turned out. The field died with a sound like a sigh. The cessation of a vibration so constant they'd stopped hearing it. For 1 full second, nobody moved. The guards at the perimeter were processing. The warden, who was at the far end of his calibration route, stopped and turned. His 3 eyes swept toward the array. Robin ran. She had always been fast, which she attributed to her years of running away from things. The guards were faster than she expected. One moved to intercept. She didn't try to go around him. She dropped her shoulder and hit him at the center of mass, which was not where a human center of mass was, but close enough. And he went sideways with a sound she'd never heard before, and she was already past him. Behind her, she heard the others. The sound of 9 people running, 8 maybe. She didn't look back. She had said she wouldn't look back. The first guard station was automated. It had been designed for exactly this contingency, a containment breach, and it responded according to its design, which was to project a focused energy barrier across the egress corridor. Robin had known this might happen. She had accordingly not planned to go through the corridor. She went over it. The barrier was projected at approximately human chest height, calibrated for the species it was containing. The structure it was mounted to was not calibrated for a human who had 11 years of obstacle course experience and a very high threshold for what she was willing to do to her own body. She hit the mounting strut, climbed it in 3 steps, and went over the top of the barrier with about 6 inches to spare, and hit the floor on the other side at a roll that put her right knee through something unpleasant, and she did not stop. She heard Dessa clear the barrier behind her, heard the sounds of the others. She didn't count. She couldn't count. 110 meters. Through 2 guard stations, they'd cleared one. The second was not automated. There were 4 Vael between them and the perimeter. 4 standing in a formation that closed every obvious line. The 47-second window was. She didn't know how long it was. She'd lost count of the seconds. The field was either still down, or it wasn't, and she couldn't know until she reached the perimeter. 4 Vael. Robin's body made a decision before her mind caught up with it. She stopped running and stood completely still. The 4 Vael watched her. She looked at the one in the center. The one whose posture, whose positioning, whose very stillness told her was the highest status. She had learned to read them. 46 days of watching had taught her to read them the way you read weather. She looked at that one, and she said very clearly in the silence, "You don't know what we can do." It was not a threat. It was as precisely as she could make it, a statement of fact. The Vael communicated in subsonic pulses. She communicated in organized air vibration. She didn't expect him to understand the words. She expected him to understand what she was doing, which was standing still in the middle of a containment breach, looking directly at him, and speaking with no fear in her voice. There was a pause that lasted approximately 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, the field came back. Robin heard it, felt it, the low return hum of the emitter array completing its reboot. The perimeter was live again. They were 70 meters short. They were contained. She stood completely still and kept her face the same. Then she heard Foos say, from somewhere behind her, in a voice that was almost amused, "Well, that's interesting." Something was happening in the formation of the 4 guards. The high-status one, the one she'd been holding eye contact with, was moving, not toward them, laterally. His 3 eyes were on Robin, with an attention that felt, for the first time since she'd arrived, like actual interest rather than cataloging. He pulsed something. Subsonic. She felt it in her back teeth. The 3 guards flanking him moved aside. Not all the way. Just enough to create a gap that was not quite an opening, but was also not quite closed. Robin looked at the gap. She looked at the guard's face. She kept her own face completely still. She took 1 step forward. The guards didn't move. She took another. Still nothing. "Everyone," she said quietly, without turning her head. "Very slowly, with me." They walked through the gap. All 9 of them. She couldn't look. She was watching the high-status guard's face. All 9 of them moved through the opening that wasn't quite an opening, past the formation that wasn't quite parted, and none of the 4 Vael touched them. On the other side of the second guard station was a service corridor that nobody had ever told her about, that she'd identified from her position in the enclosure by the quality of the light at a specific time of day. She went straight to it. She didn't run. Something told her that running now would undo whatever had just happened. They walked. The service corridor ended in an emergency pressure lock that Dessa had opened in 40 seconds. On the other side was the outer hull of the Vael installation. And beyond the outer hull was a landscape that Robin didn't recognize. Low, amber-lit, with something like vegetation in the middle distance that moved in a wind she couldn't feel from inside. They stood in the lock and looked at it. "Where are we?" Mako said. It wasn't quite a question. "Doesn't matter," Dessa said. "We're outside." They went outside. The subsequent 3 days were the worst of Robin's life, which was saying something, because her life had contained some objectively very bad days. The landscape was alien in a way that had nothing to do with aesthetics. The biology was wrong, the light was wrong, the gravity was slightly low in a way that felt helpful for the first hour, and then mildly nauseating for the next 12. They ate nothing. They drank water from a source that Dr. Foos said was probably safe, and that Robin decided to trust because the alternative was dehydration. Renard Kowalczyk walked in near silence for most of day 1 and then on the evening of day 1 sat down and said, clearly and conversationally, "I think I'm all right now," and did not explain what he meant by that, and nobody asked. They found the Coalition forward operating base on day 3 by following a signal that Sola picked up on a piece of equipment she'd had in her boot. A signal booster the size of a credit card that she produced with the unconcerned air of someone who simply habitually carried signal boosters in their boots, which, given her history, was probably accurate. The debrief lasted 11 hours. Robin told it straight, in order with the specific factual precision she'd been trained to use. The intelligence officers leaned forward when she described the emitter array, and further forward when she described the diagnostic cycle. And by the time she got to the high-status guard, and the gap in the formation, they were very still, in the way that people get still when they're trying not to show how excited they are. "He let you through," one of them said. "I think he was curious," Robin said. "I think he'd been watching us for 52 days and decided he wanted to see what happened next." "You're describing emotional complexity in a Vael we have no record of." "I'm describing behavior I observed," Robin said. "What it means is your department." They wanted her to stay. There were follow-up questions, additional sessions, a psychological evaluation she sat through, with patient good humor, and answered honestly. She wasn't in trauma, which seemed to confuse the evaluators. She explained, as best she could, that spending 52 days in close quarters, with 8 other people under conditions of extreme adversity, had not broken her because it had not been the first time. And because she had not spent those 52 days waiting to be rescued. She had spent them doing the next thing, and then the next thing, and then the thing after that. You reverse-engineered an alien energy system with a wire and an old woman who was doing mathematics in the dust, the evaluator said. She did most of the engineering, Robin said. I did most of the bending, Doctor. Foos was offered a position at every major research institution in human space simultaneously, in what she described as a lovely pile of letters that arrived all at once. Very flattering. She accepted the one that gave her the largest blackboard. Dessa Varga went back to survey work within 6 weeks, which everyone who knew her said was completely unsurprising. Pockets was promoted. Mako and Ndiaye received commendations. Renard Kowalczyk resigned from the diplomatic service and, in what Robin found unexpectedly moving when she heard about it, took a job teaching language to children in a colony settlement on the edge of the expansion frontier. Slutz disappeared for 3 months and then reappeared as an intelligence asset so effective that Robin was told about it only because they thought she might have noticed the girl's particular skills before they had. She said so, the war continued. The Vael pressed forward on 3 fronts and then 2, and then held, and then, slowly, over the course of a year that Robin spent mostly in the field rather than any office, began to pull back. Not because humanity had found a weapon that matched theirs. Not because the coalition had outmaneuvered them strategically. Because information had started to flow in the right direction. Dr. Foos's analysis of the emitter array, cross-referenced with signals intelligence gathered over the preceding 14 months, cracked the frequency encoding of Vael communication. Not perfectly. Not in a way that allowed real-time translation, not for years, but enough to understand the broad structure of orders. Enough to know when a formation was advancing rather than flanking. Enough to stop reacting and start anticipating. Desta's architectural eye, applied to the Vael installation schematics she'd memorized during 7 weeks of having nothing else to do, became the foundation of a targeting doctrine that reduced the effectiveness of Vael defensive positioning by something the military analysts called considerable, and that the soldiers on the ground called finally. The intelligence gathered from the debrief of 9 survivors who had spent weeks doing nothing but watch. Robin heard about each development with the dull satisfaction of someone watching a long calculation arrive at the right answer. She was not surprised. She had spent a long time in that humming cage, thinking about what the Vael had gotten wrong. They had made the error of assuming that a species capable of building tools was static once the tools were catalogued. They had looked at human technology and concluded they understood human capability. They had never considered that the technology was beside the point. The point was the paperclip. The point was 17 minutes and 1 paperclip and a roll of electrical tape, making a broken thing work. Not because you'd been ordered to, and not because it was strategically significant, but because the machine was broken, and you were there, and you knew how to do the next thing. The Vael had never made anything work on spite. They didn't know what spite was. They didn't know what it meant to fix a coffee machine at the end of a double shift and pour a cup you'd never finish and feel, despite everything, a specific small satisfaction in the fact that the machine worked now. It was 18 months after the escape, before Robin ran into the high-status guard again. She was part of the coalition diplomatic team. Not as a diplomat. She was emphatic about this. She was there as a security and protocol consultant, which was a title they'd given her because the person who actually understands how Vael think based on having stared at them for 52 days didn't fit on the credential badge. The Enchant contact talks were happening on neutral ground, a station built specifically for the purpose, and the Vael delegation arrived in a configuration that the analysts had spent 3 months trying to predict. Robin recognized the high-status guard immediately. She had spent 52 days memorizing his posture. He crossed the reception area with the silent efficiency of his kind, and stopped 2 meters away and looked at her with 3 eyes arranged in a triangle on a face as smooth and pale as old bone. She looked back. He pulsed something. Low frequency below the threshold of normal hearing. She felt it in her back teeth. The interpreter they'd brought. A program, not a person, running on the partial decryption that Foos's work had made possible, rendered it as untranslatable phrase, approximate register, recognition, possible implication of deliberate cessation. Robin thought about that for a moment. Then she said, in a voice she kept very even, "You didn't have to let us through." The interpreter worked on it. Came back with a rendering she had to have explained twice before she understood it. And even then she wasn't sure she did. It was something like, incomplete observation, suspended, awaiting further information, implication of continuation. He had been curious. He had, in the middle of a containment breach, made the decision to see what happened next. And now, the implication seemed to be, he was still watching, still waiting to see what the next thing would be. She understood that. She understood it in a way she couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't spent 52 days in a humming cage, turning a stone over and over, looking for the edge that caught light. She didn't smile, she kept her face the same. But she let her voice have something in it when she said, "Then I guess we see what comes next." He watched her for a long moment with those three triangulated eyes. Then he turned and walked toward the negotiation table. She followed. In the break room of the station, it had one. Someone had thought to build one. Bless whoever that was. There was a coffee machine. It was functioning. She'd checked on arrival. She had not yet had a cup. She would, she thought, when this was done. When the next thing had been done, and the thing after that, she would go to the break room, and she would pour a cup, and she would drink the whole thing. She went into the negotiation room. There was a lot of work left to do.